Hey, I'm Tim Seymour. I'm CIO of Seymour Asset Management, but I'm also an advisor for KushCo Holdings. And I'm here with Nick Kovacevich, CEO of KushCo. Nick, exciting times in the industry that we're in, and certainly for me to be someone that's working closely with the company. And maybe, some background, Nick and I know each other a long time, but I mean, ultimately, I think the orientation on the industry for me and why I'm so focused on it as an investor, and ultimately, the way I see the evolution of the industry. But real quick, I'm by background, I'm an emerging markets investor. So I have invested in what feels like new asset classes that are rising up out of just a great fundamental story. Often there's a top-down element to the catalyst that gets a lot of focus. So when I just put my investor hat on and I think about the cannabis industry, to me this reminds me of living out in Russia in the late '90s, or kicking around in Brazil in the early 2000s, and some of the main themes are alive and well. So I approach cannabis both as an investor and someone that sees these consumption trends continue to evolve. I'm running a investment company where ultimately my investors are looking for high growth opportunities in places where I can assess risk and bring kind of that same level of experience in investing. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so fascinating to get to know a company like KushCo, just because in fact you guys play a role in the middle of the industry that really has you not only as kind of a nexus in between all different parts of the industry, but the classic vertically integrated associations that you have. You're obviously also a company that's building out your own presence and your own, effectively your own brands and your own products, and ultimately there's an evolution of all of this. So I think it would be great to hear a little bit from you what really your first of all, how this started for you, and then I'd really just like to get hey, what's the state of the industry today? We know there's excitement. We also know that there's problems. We know that there's structural issues that need to be overcome. And independent of that, you're a CEO of a young company that has a complex kind of manufacturing approach, logistics chain, capital markets dynamics, and I don't care what industry you'd be in. You'd have your hands full.
Yeah.
So
no, and what's great is about us having this conversation is you have your background, everything you've done, which has now lend your perspective for cannabis and how it's playing out, starting with your involvement here in Wall Street.
Right.
And I'm an entrepreneur from California, started this company in 2010, so I've been in the industry almost a decade,
right.
And I've seen every state roll out, whether it was Colorado in 2014 or now Massachusetts just opening up retailers as early as November of last year. So I've got a unique perspective and lens because we're providing products and services to those businesses that are opening up and emerging.
Right.
And I think we both see the world the same way, but we also have some of our own unique perspectives. So I'd love to talk about that more today.
How did you parachute into this industry? I'm sure it wasn't a parachute, actually. I'm sure it was a thoughtful kind of next phase of a career that had already been an entrepreneur.
Well, I was 24 years old, so I don't know how thoughtful I was at the time.
Come on.
And it was my business partner Dallas in Bimbo, who's on our board of directors. Right. Dallas is an entrepreneur. I mean, the guy had a business when we were going to high school together. He was DJing school dances, right. And later when I finished college, he had another company he'd started in college. It was a moving and storage business called Pack My Dorm. So we were never in cannabis and looking to figure out how to parlay that into a legal business. Right. We were just entrepreneurs that were in business, yep. Looking for an opportunity. And when you're a young entrepreneur and you basically know nothing about anything, would you rather go into an established industry and try to figure out how to take business away from the established players, yep. Or would you rather go into a brand new industry that nobody's even targeting? And that's the opportunity that was the case in California when we started the company back in 2010.
Yeah, and what were your biggest impediments then? Because launching a new business, being an entrepreneur at every stage of the path, what was the most difficult thing, stepping into the cannabis world, really in the manufacturing level?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we learned really early on that financial services was going to be an issue. Yeah. I think year one, we had our bank account at Chase Bank shut down. So we started dealing with those issues.
How you doing?
Oh yeah, we've
Welcome.
that was just the start, right?
Yeah.
We've had virtually every other bank shut us
Right.
down along the way, and we're fortunate to find a home.
Right.
So there are players out there, but it makes no sense because if you look at our business, well, yeah, we're focused on cannabis and we're providing products and services, but so are companies like PG&E.
Right.
So are companies like Scott's Miracle-Gro, and bet they're not losing bank accounts.
Right.
So something to do with our name, obviously being focused on the space solely and how we market, it just creates a stigma. So that was the biggest challenge, the stigma, understanding, hey, how do you communicate to your friends and family that you're now in this cannabis industry that everyone thinks is very seedy and shady.
Right.
And it wasn't until, it became mainstream and, really just a few years ago, 2015, 2016, everyone started to transition from, you're in what industry, to, oh, I heard you're in the cannabis
Right,
industry.
right.
And now they want to talk about
Yeah.
it. So it's been a great evolution to watch that play out.
I mean, this kind of the state of the nation in cannabis right now, and this is something that I've seen from 25 years in the capital markets world, but also even just professionally, right? Where suddenly there's an area of interest and an area of focus from an investment perspective that people were there was a lot of misperceptions. There was trepidation. There was a lack of traditional vehicles to invest in that way. And so whether that was investing also in commodities, and we had this super cycle of commodities that if you told someone you were investing in commodities in the late 90s or in the mid 90s or in the mid 80s, I mean, people knew about orange juice futures and people on the floor of the exchange running around going crazy, but hardly sexy, right? Hardly necessarily an area where a lot of people were saying, hey, I want to be there, and in fact, this is where I can make a lot of money. And suddenly, as we got into early 2000, 2001, and oil prices went from $9 and started to go up to 40, 50, on their way up to 140. But then everybody and their brother had a mining asset in Canada or in Eastern Europe or in Russia or some of these typically far-flung places, by the way, where people before that, if I told someone I was doing some mining in Zimbabwe, they would have looked at me like, you're crazy in the mid 90s. By 2002, if I said, hey, I've got a mining asset in Zimbabwe, people would be like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
can I talk to you about that? So I feel that's where we are with cannabis now.
Yeah,
and it's
it
good
is.
and bad, isn't it? I mean, on some level,
Yeah.
it feels like it's nice that the stigma is away, and I think truly there's a thoughtful approach to the societal benefits, the classic consumer products story, the lifestyle dynamics, and the relationship between the dynamics that are very real on the health and medical side and the legal side. But it feels a little bubblicious right now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And I think, that's the problem when something gets so much hype, that it's going to attract that crowd. And I think, that's where we're at as an industry is, the hype is real. People want to participate in the space. Everyone knows the opportunity is gigantic.
Yeah.
It's going to start to turn and be like any other business where it comes down to execution. It comes down to your financial performance. And that's how a lot of these businesses are going to start to get graded now that we've gotten over that initial kind of, excitement around the space.
It seems that the hard part about that is, the good news for KushCo is the company is executing, and ultimately, at least the guidance that's been given for 2019 is 135 million.
140 to 150 million.
Okay,
yeah.
so
and we're coming up on the end of our fiscal year, which is at the end of August. So
right.
that's we have an early fiscal year. So calendar year, you're talking about even bigger numbers
right.
than that.
So at a time when execution is happening, and the demands upon execution, of course, as your business grows, the intensity of your capital dynamics and the intensity of really the manufacturing cycle, the intensity of the customer relations increases. And yet, here you are still stuck in an industry that's in low gear on a lot of traditional, of course, banking. That's probably the most understood impediment. So more is expected of you at a time when, on some level, the infrastructure around you hasn't gotten a lot better.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's ultimately going to prevent a lot of companies from having the type of meaningful profits that some investors are looking for.
Right.
Hey, it's hard to run a profitable business when you're running around trying to figure out who will do your merchant processing, who's going to do your banking, how are you going to collect all this cash, physical cash, and make sure that your employees are safe while they're doing it. When normal businesses, that's not even a thought,
Right.
right? It's just assumed we're going to have a bank account, we're going to get a line of credit, we're going to get all of these traditional financial services that people have been accustomed to for decades. For us, it's a real challenge, and so it takes time and energy away, and yet we're still able to grow the business. Last quarter, our results at $35 million, we were up almost 250% annually. So I always kind of think about, imagine if we didn't have all this other stuff sucking up our time and dragging us, what could we be doing at that point? It's kind of scary to think about.
Some of your suppliers are not industry folk, right? I mean, you have raw input and materials, and then obviously just logistics and manufacturing inputs into your business. How do they work with you to be as flexible as they can be? They see a customer whose business is growing 200% on a CAGR basis. So do you find that the folks in your manufacturing chain, your client chain, are they helping you during this time, or do you find that this is a case where really we're fighting this alone?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's, obviously people want to get involved in the cannabis industry, and we become a great conduit to get them exposure to the space. There's a growth space. Every business in the country, for the most part, wants to grow. Yeah. Some are more aggressive than others. Right. But we basically unlock that for them. So there is a positive relationship with a lot of our suppliers, but we also are always constantly having to explain the situation, de-risk the situation for them. So you're selling on all fronts. You're selling yourself to a financial institution to get established with an account. You're selling to a vendor to get set up with good terms, and you're selling, of course, to your customer base and trying to get them to buy products from you. So you're always on, and it's that level of intensity around the clock. And so much is happening. I mean, it feels like every month you're accomplishing what most businesses accomplish in a quarter or in a year. Yeah. Because of the speed this industry is moving.
The vision you have into your customers is pretty unique, and in some cases maybe more vision than they want someone to have on their business. Can you make some assessments? Of course, those that are anonymous. And in fact, in many cases, I'm sure you have observations that are quite laudatory and complimentary in terms of some of the operators that are truly upshifting and really doing tremendous things. Give me a sense of talk about your customer base and talk about what the insight you see right now.
Yeah, so I mean, our customer base it ranges from the big Canadian LPs that we're all aware of. Many of them are listed here on the NASDAQ and NYSE. Yep. The multi-state operators who, some of these guys have phenomenal footprints. They're growing their business tremendously, yet they're forced to list on the Canadian Securities Exchange because they have operations here in the U.S. So that's a very interesting dynamic that's very frustrating, especially for some of the customers that we represent. But I'm a big believer in the whole sector. Like you, I'm also an investor in the space. Right. So, I see value in all of these companies. I see value in, the Canadian LPs and the way that they're able to access the global market, right? Tremendous advantage that they have. Those capital markets that they have access to allows them to raise better financing than the American counterparts, and it's going to allow them to continue to win until something changes here in the U.S. Then you got your multi-state operators. They're going out getting licenses in these highly restrictive states. There's a lot of value in those licenses, and then they're securing real estate, especially on the retail side, that's in prime locations. It's very defensible. Yeah. We see very high margin business there. So a lot of opportunity for the U.S. players and even the brands. The big cannabis brands will be built over these next few years, and it's hard to pick who's going to be that winner. But that there's going to be some folks that emerge on top, or at the very least, are an attractive acquisition for the bigger companies that eventually want to come play the space. So I think there's a lot of ways to play it. We do have a unique insight. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, so it's a great opportunity because I get to meet a lot of these management teams and understand.
You're in a PhD or certainly an MBA program every day in terms of being an entrepreneur and seeing how different guys are making it work in this index.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. There's a lot of great operators, a lot of passion in this space, and ultimately I think for an investor, there's a lot of upside.
Yeah, there is, and I think that's where the double-edged sword comes, because I think the investments that we're making in the sector at times feel like they need to have this high kind of return profile, especially in the short to medium term, when it's argued that it should be moving commensurate with the overall growth in the industry. The reality is that I think a lot of the companies that are putting down roots and growing their businesses now are arguably a couple of years or a few years away from really seeing that, call it that hockey stick moment, even though on a relative basis they're seeing it now, but really in terms where they're going to be competing with the eventual competition that comes outside of the industry whenever this federal construct changes, I think is what makes it challenging for those companies. It makes it challenging for investors because as we got started earlier in the conversation, the expectations are that there's money and then there are hills. Like it's like people believe that they're going to be part of this get-rich-quick scheme, and I think that's dangerous. And the kind of work that we have to do on as investors is really the most important thing. It's that cliche that you hear about, I think, in traditional private equity or VC investing, but I would rather invest in an A+ management team with a B product.
No, you hit the nail on the head, and I think that's the only way to play the space, because if you look at our business, right, number one, I started in 2010. If you went into a dispensary in 2010, you wouldn't see any brands.
Right.
Okay, everything was just basically generic product, strain names. It was 90% flour. The edibles were brownies and cookies. There was no concentrates. There was no vape pens. Right now you go into a dispensary, what are the highest growth categories?
Sure.
Edibles, vape pens, soon to be beverages, right, which hasn't even hit the market in a big way yet. And so the world's changed, the cannabis world's changed, 10 times over in these 10 years that we've been in it. And so if you're an investor, right, you shouldn't look at my business or any of these businesses and say, oh, I can see exactly how this is going to be in 5 years or 10 years time. Right. We know it's going to change. And so the good operators are the ones that know how to change and pivot along with it, continuing to position the company in a better, stronger foothold. And I think we've demonstrated that we can do that. I mean, today, if you look at our product sales, we're not just selling packaging. That's what we did for the formative years of our company. And now we're selling vape pens. We're selling hydrocarbon gases and solvents. We're selling supplies. We're selling natural products. All these new high growth, high value categories that we've gotten into, and that's just with current products and services. There's opportunities to leverage our network. Think about our network of the folks that we deal with on a regular basis. I mean, like I said, everyone from the large Canadian LPs and multi-state operators to the regional brands and even the mom and pop shops. And we're providing them with products, but we can monetize that network in a lot of different ways. And and obviously can't disclose here, but we've got some exciting initiatives that we're going to be bringing out that just shows what we can actually do with our business that's very intriguing. It's high growth, high margin categories, but it's not even on anyone's radar screen today. So we're going to continue to evolve and create more value where we see opportunity, and we need investors that believe in us and our ability to do that.
Well, in the value chain that exists now for KushCo, so let's talk about core packaging, let's talk about vape pens, let's talk about hydrocarbons. Talk about this from a margin perspective. I think people look at the industry, and at times, again, the criticism is that margins. You guys hear this, and people. There's certain parts of your business that are low margin business and higher margin than others. So as you look at the existing segments, let alone the stuff that's exciting and in the pipeline, talk about how you see it evolving and. That in the context of kind of asset heavy, asset light for the entire industry, because I think this is a debate everybody has right now as they look at this relative to other industries that have grown.
Yeah, and I think the margin thing for us has been a sticking point, right? And I think at the core, right, we're a sales and distribution business. Those businesses create a lot more operating leverage at scale. We're trying to get to scale as quickly as possible, and we're doing that, right? So bear with us. The direct material margins on our products are strong, right? What we buy the products for and what we sell them for. And where we've floundered has been operational efficiencies, right? When you have to airship product in from China to meet customer demand, you're not making a very good margin on that product. Right. But if you take care of your customers, right? You're going to have that business for the long term, and eventually you're going to figure out how to ship that product efficiently across the sea, right? And so we're getting there, and we're seeing that throughput, and you should see our margins improving. But there's an opportunity to have a very sound margin business at large scale, producing meaningful EBITDA. And when investors start to see that happening, I bet there's going to be a lot more excitement around our story.
Which of those segments that we've talked about, though, seem the most exciting to KushCo right
They
now?
all are. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing growth everywhere. I think, packaging's our core. I think there's a ton of opportunity with packaging, especially in Canada, and we're just getting warmed up there. So you should see that part of our business really grow. We're doing some great stuff on the innovation front. As you know, we have our own innovation arm, which is called Coletto. These are, mechanical engineers and designers that can essentially build unique form factors, and we've got some phenomenal products that we're launching in the market here soon. We've made meaningful investments into developing eco-friendly, sustainable options. We know that that's where the market is going to go. We're going to be a leader. We're going to get there first, and we're going to really be able to benefit from having a suite of products that are biodegradable and compostable, and something that consumers really are asking for now. We're going to be able to take advantage of that. Then you got your vape category is not slowing down anytime soon. We just see those.
No, I mean,
numbers go
I
one
would argue
direction.
that this is really the most dynamic part of the subsectors right now, especially because of not only the technology that's truly going into some of these products, but obviously the way consumption is changing a bit. I realize that there's old school, it's still going to be flower, it's still going to be pre-rolled, but the reality is that not just for health reasons, but for convenience, for efficiency. I mean, some of it's even just efficiency. If you're going to spend, $90, $100 a gram on a high-end product, you want a vape product that's going to allow an efficient approach to consumption.
That's exactly right. And the whole vape game changed when CCELL came in and launched their patented ceramic heating technology. They've got great technology, great infrastructure to be able to manufacture, GMP certified, right? Everything of where this industry is going, CCELL is prepared to do, we're prepared to do as a partner with them, and these products are very effective in the market. We're seeing the numbers, and ultimately the vape oil category is also supported by our hydrocarbon business. So you can't produce the oil unless you have quality butane or propane or ethanol, and we've made serious investments there. We see that starting to tick up. The acquisitions we've done have been phenomenal. We acquired a vape company in May of 17, doing $8 million in LTM sales. We did 20 in the next 12 months, right? It's incredible. Then we acquired a hydrocarbon business last year, and we have, we're right at the 1 year mark, and we haven't put out the numbers, but that business has, roughly doubled from when we bought it. So it's a growth story on all fronts, and it's organic growth, but we're accelerating that by making acquisitions to get us into new categories. And the value is our network, because I can essentially take any product or service. If it's something that's valuable to our customer base, I can get it in the hands of well over 1,000 meaningful players in virtually 60 to 90 days, and start seeing that throughput. And so you're onto something if you can take it and then generate 2 or 3 or 4x of what it was doing before right out the gate, and then you just ride that wave for years to come.
Do you find that because you have this insight into your customer base and the production chain, but also really where their end demand is, what the consumption trends are, what the consumer tastes are, which brands are working, which ones are not. How do you, how does that weave into your vision of KushCo? And at some point, some might argue, I'm sure you're very careful about competing with your customers, but this is a place where you have moved into products. You have proprietary, brands that you're building effectively. So I guess it's great that you have that insight. At what point do you feel like your customers may be cautious about what you know about their business, but more importantly, are you ever going to be competing with them head on?
No, I mean, look, we don't touch the plant, right? That's their job. We want to power them to be able to do that more efficiently, right? We want to handle all the back end stuff that they shouldn't even be worrying about, right? If you're in a high growth industry like cannabis, do you want to be spending time manufacturing? Do you want to be spending time managing logistics from China? Do you want to be spending time, doing your own materials, or do you want to outsource that to a partner that you can rely on, and you focus on sales and distribution, scaling your business? Right. And so that's really the thesis of our core value proposition. It's resonating really well in the market. Obviously, it's different for how we approach a regional brand versus how we approach a multi-state operator versus how we approach a Canadian LP.
Very different.
Very different, right? And so that's where we've been focused on how do we create more value for customer segment X. And we think about that all the time. We think about value creation because ultimately nobody is going to pay a tax to buy a product if you're not getting value out of it. Right. If you're creating more value than you're charging, that's how you see the phenomenal growth that we're getting. And so we always have to be mindful, always trying to create value. We're a friend to everybody in the industry. And of course, some people in the industry that we work with don't like other people that we work with. So we have to silo that information and make sure that it's never shared. Yep. But that's our job. I mean, we're a conduit. We're right in the middle. And I think that's why you can look at our data and you can make macro predictions. I mean, we're seeing the market data out of Massachusetts, our sales data. It's incredible. We're growing over 100% each quarter in Massachusetts. So that market's throughput is there because you can see it in our numbers.
Well, we live in a world where data is the new asset and the asset that's really what people are willing to pay for. Mm-hmm. Talk about that. I mean, is that ever a business you could see yourself in? I mean, clearly,
yeah.
Your CRM, all your logistics, your ERP network gives you a lot of hard, critical data on the industry all the time.
All the time, and like I mentioned, we've got some new initiatives that right. We'll be leveraging that to create more value in different areas that we're not currently in. So we always have to think about our position in the marketplace, what our filter is, what we're getting, and then how do we then turn it around and monetize it and create value for our shareholders. So that's our job. And I mean, you have insight, right? You're talking to investors all the time. You're probably getting a lot of these questions. Well, it's great, your affiliation with us. The ability to kind of have that lens, it gives you a different perspective that you can share with the investor community. Because if you're not in cannabis full-time, 100%, then you're basically out of the loop, right? Yeah. It's happening that fast, it's that dynamic that you need to be entrenched to understand. And so we have a great position where we're seeing all this stuff and formulating our own thesis about trends and where we see the market going. And that's information that you could use when you're talking to your constituents.
No, it's great. Look, I feel very fortunate to be in a place where I sit in an advisory role with KushCo and a handful of other companies in the industry, and the connectivity that it gives me into everything from the production chain all the way through to the technology and DTC and then ultimately the capital markets dynamics are really critical too, which is another area we should talk about.
Let's talk about it. I mean,
I think it's an exciting crossroads right now, but as much as it's been exciting to go out there and have a company with a $450 million market cap and that you think is going to be a significant multiple of that in the near future. Capital markets have been a constraint, and they've been something that have been largely talked about and maybe misunderstood. So my view is that this is changing faster than people think. I think you and I were down in Washington a couple days ago, and part of a really interesting, effective, and important day where the cannabis industry was essentially on Capitol Hill and talking to legislators and talking to government agencies. My sense is that this isn't about when and if, and this isn't about, hey, these folks that have now come out into the mainstream need to be pushed back into the illicit market. No, fortunately, we're not fighting that battle right now. We're really fighting a battle of how, now that the genie's out of the bottle, how do you deal with the environment that exists where you still have local laws, state laws that need to be respected, and certainly are part of this massive quick change of tide. But you have to deal with the federal infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, so, kind of two topics that are worth discussing. Obviously, the capital markets, also what's happening in the illicit markets and the confluence of that with the emergence of legal markets, right? It's interesting, fascinating dynamics that are playing out. But back to the capital markets, I mean, just to set the stage, right, so everyone's aware. So you have a scenario here in the U.S. where the businesses operating in the U.S. that are generating significant revenue off of key markets like California, Nevada, Massachusetts, they have zero access to U.S. institutions and U.S. exchanges. So they're forced to go list up on the Canadian Securities Exchange. They're forced to be supported by a lot of retail investors. And then you have these Canadian companies who can't touch the U.S., but they get access to NYSE and NASDAQ. And in one sense, right, we've shown that that's probably even more important. The capital markets component is more important than the operational component, which is crazy to think about.
Well, it's a massive growth. It's a land grab. And so if you can put a balance sheet together, and as much as it's been easy to be critical of companies that have zero revenues but have $300 and $400 million on the balance sheet, as an investor, I give them credit for having been able to build that war chest. It may not be enough in the long term, by the way. I mean, people are burning through cash like there's no tomorrow.
Right, I totally agree. But the ability to have that can set you up for success if you can execute, right? And so if you can't get that cash, you never have the opportunity. I mean, how many businesses in this industry just are cash starved right now, and they're not going to be able to make that next jump? I mean, we've seen it in California. Some of the premier brands that have been around for years and years struggling to make that next leap because they haven't put themselves in a position to access capital, investor capital, public markets, et cetera. And now they're getting passed up by companies that are accessing the markets better. So it's a huge advantage, and it's something that you have to be in tune with. And these dynamics are wonky, as I explained, right? So, I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I know, we talked in D.C., something like the States Act would certainly solve it. But when do you think these exchanges here in the U.S. start to open up? The other dynamic, right, is these exchanges are evaluating cannabis companies that are looking to list. Well, what about listed companies that are starting to get into cannabis? There's going to be a huge discrepancy. It's complex. And how do you deal with it all?
I think they're going to have to come up with a set of rules that include a matrix for percentage of revenues, for example, and that's going to be a case where.
But the percentage of revenues, and a lot of people have gone there, right? And it's a valid argument. Oh, well, what percentage of your revenue is derived? But why is that illegal? An argument? Because it's either you're violating the law or you're not.
Yep.
It doesn't matter if it's 1% of law violation or 99% of law violation. It should be no law violation, right? If you're violating the law, that's a problem. Or let everybody who's violating the law list because you say, hey, at least they're state compliant. But I don't think you can have in between, although a lot of people are going that way.
There can't be shades of gray.
Yeah.
And so people talk about something like a Scotts Miracle-Gro, right? But Scotts Miracle-Gro, are they touching the plant? Well, I mean, they are. I mean, they're certainly fertilizing the plant. But ultimately, it's an ancillary business that's risen up. I agree. The minute that there is, and I believe that the letter of the law is formally being followed right now. I don't think, and this is why we haven't seen some of the big multinationals make the type of splash into the industry that would essentially put all of that at risk for them.
Yeah.
Because you think about the fiduciary responsibility they have to shareholders, and obviously the legal dynamics of their core business, and they are just not in a position. It's why. I don't mean to imply that Coke's ready to go. I don't mean to imply that Bud's ready to go, but they're ready to go.
Yeah. Well, look,
they have to be.
You're not seeing what's happening in cannabis and not thinking about how are we going to get in and win, right? So it's on everybody's radar screen. They're all prepped, right? And
every
the question is when.
Fortune 500 company has a strategy for cannabis.
Yeah.
So I think the listing standards are. I think they're changing, and I think
So you think we'll get more clarity on that?
I think we're going to get more clarity. I think the exchanges themselves are asking for clarity. I think the exchanges, of course, are commercially oriented businesses as well. They want to make money. They see a
huge
growth
opportunity
industry.
for them.
Huge opportunity.
Yeah.
And so I think they clearly are looking for those access points that give them the foot in now. So they've been able to list some companies that they believe are stepping outside of the federal restriction. But the federal restriction needs to change.
Yeah, that does need to change.
And to me, I'll let the legislators figure this out, but ultimately the issues on the table are pretty straightforward in a world where the states have voted. And
look at
payments.
just look at the hypocrisy with cannabis being a Schedule I drug, which cocaine is a Schedule II, right? Makes no sense. But the definition of a Schedule I drug is it has no medicinal value. Yet on the other hand, another arm of the government, right, has approved the FDA a drug. Epidiolex, that they say has medicinal value. So those two are in conflict. So at the very least, let's just get this thing descheduled or rescheduled ASAP. That needs to happen.
Which would, then we don't worry about the Banking Act.
Yeah, we don't need it.
I think that's going to be a tougher journey. I think it's going to be a tougher journey to get full descheduling before we can get banking. I mean, banking can ultimately default to on a state level. There's the people have voted, and they've made a determination. And we always hear this debate whether it's adult versus medical or recreational. But the bottom line is that distinction. I think really belies the reality. People are medicating themselves. People are consuming the product and the derivative products for really the same reason, if you ask me. But some are more obvious and some are more OTC and can fall into a nice bucket. I think the ability for businesses that can be legal in the states that pass those laws to bank is an easier mousetrap to fix right now.
And I think we all agree, anybody agrees, that it's safer to have that cash off the street, out of the duffel bags, into the banking system, right? How could you dispute that? So they need to get something done. We have the Safe Banking Act. Hopefully that can get done. Certainly the States Act would be a much bigger initiative that would fix everything as well.
I think that's right. And then somewhere in here are also just very well-established IRS dynamics with 280E, which effectively is basically taxing retailers or anyone who has multiple cost of goods sold that they can't deduct from their core business. It's making it impossible for a legal market to really operate. And this is where I believe there is rationality in Washington on this. I think ultimately there's an understanding that yes, okay, under a scheduled dynamic, these are activities that have to fall under an IRS guideline that's very clear. But the good news here is this is not a topic that had to have been addressed outside of this industry. And I think on some level you can be very encouraged by the pace of legislation at this point. I think, to me,
certainly a lot of momentum.
6 months.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not they can get stuff done is to be determined, but there's a lot of momentum, a lot of support for many of these initiatives. So hopefully,
it's a bipartisan issue.
It is.
It's a case where to you and I, there's not a debate on Schedule I relative to other substances out there. I think the reality is that everybody who's involved in the industry wants it to be compliant, wants it to be operated in a way where minors are not exposed, just like any other industry where minors are not supposed to be exposed.
I agree.
And I think some of the criticism around the industry, which is addressing brain development and people that are getting into psychosis arguments, and I think these are tangents that are not getting at the core fact here. You can talk all you want about that. The reality is that I don't want 15-year-old kids smoking pot. I don't want 15-year-old kids drinking whiskey. I don't want 15-year-old kids smoking cigarettes. So I don't see why there has to be that confusion.
Well, yeah, I mean, and alcohol is legal, and people are having debates about how bad it is for you, right? I mean, we probably know it's not good for you, and that's okay. And some people, choose not to drink alcohol, and that's okay. And I think the frustration for me and other folks in the industry is we're not talking about giving access to something. We're talking about people are accessing something. Do you want it to occur in illicit, illegal market supporting cartels and drug organizations, or do you want those transactions to occur in the legal market supporting American businesses and generating tax dollars for the citizens? And to me, that's a fundamental question, what it comes down to. And I don't know why anyone would vote for the latter when there's an opportunity to create a legal system, a legal framework that's safer, that's more efficient, and ultimately gives back to the community.
And you know, the FDA at times could seem like the enemy, but the bottom line is I want to know what I'm consuming. I want someone there to protect me. I probably lean more libertarian than anything in life, but I want my government for a few things. I definitely want my government to protect me, and I want my government, in the case of regulating substances that are put out there on shelves to people. Consistency and obviously safety factors are critical. And this is the kind of stuff that also should get entrepreneurs in the industry truly excited about the potential of the total addressable market. Because I think once you can actually give people a consistent, predictable product that they feel is safe, and again, we can debate issues around whether smoking anything is good for you. I think that's probably not a difficult debate. But leaving aside the substance classifications, the reality is that if you tell people that they can walk into a store and they can pick up the same product every single time, just like they're buying a Bayer aspirin, and you go in OTC.
And it's been signed off by the FDA, it's safe,
Not only that, and right, whether it's recreational, whether it's medical, whether it's adult, whether it's wellness, whether it's medicating yourself in some way, which has formal and informal applications. The bottom line is people are going to do this, and they're doing it every single day. And there are people that want in. There are people that want in. I think the most powerful demographic for the cannabis industry are the people either who tried at one point and said, whoa, I don't even know what I just did. I'm not sure if it's safe. I'm not sure how I felt about it. Or I know my experience was totally inconsistent from one product to the next. Bringing predictability back into it, and then also truly, the beauty of this plant is it's so complex, and the cannabinoids that are able to deal with a multitude of, I think, call it maladies, but I mean, you could make an argument that 80% of the causes that have people walk into a drugstore, at least from an OTC perspective, there's proven efficacy.
You can address it with one plant in different ways. I totally agree.
So I think that's what makes this really exciting, and that's why as we get to kind of the state of the industry and where. Look, the exciting part here is not the existing user. Let's get at the market size here. It's the crossover.
It's the new users. I say it all the time. Think about all the people consuming cannabis today, and then think about the people that are going to be consuming in 10 years. And you're talking about at a minimum, a 3x to maybe a 5x in terms of a lot of entrepreneurs are saying, hey, we're focused on that, and it makes sense. But I wanted to bring the conversation back to something that we've talked about, and it's a hot topic, both in mainstream but also in the industry, and that's this illicit market, right? The black market activity. We're hearing from businesses that it's hurting their business, their legal business, because they have to pay taxes, they have to pay payroll taxes, right? They have to charge a premium for their product, whereas the illicit market doesn't. They don't test their product, right? So it's harder to do business in the legal market. It's more expensive to do business in the legal market. And on one hand, people say, hey, this is why cannabis shouldn't be legal, because now you've got this underbelly of this black market that people are now freewheeling because there's no penalties, right? And that's a legit argument to some degree. Where I like to go is, the good news is every single day there's more transactions occurring in the legal market. So even though you still have some, it's better than having 100% of the transactions occur in the illegal market, which was the case prior to 2014 when Colorado legalized. So we've made significant improvements. Let's not go backwards. But let's talk about some of those dynamics in the illicit market. I mean, do you think that this is something that the states can figure out? I mean, California has a major problem, or is this something where we need the free enterprise to figure it out, and we need to look at reducing taxes? What's your take on it?
I think we're gonna where we are is we've started out with the government trying to assess a taxable number that's also kind of reverse engineered probably from budget dynamics. I don't think it makes sense. And I think it's a function of really where people believe they could have gotten the legislation through. Hey, based upon this, here's what this equals in revenues. I mean, I think it's been, what backwards. So I think the finding the balance between what is fair to tax this product at vis-a-vis, look at tax levels in tobacco, look at tax levels in alcohol, look at tax levels in other seemingly luxury goods, VATs.
It's gonna come in that range.
It has to.
Yeah.
It has to, and because we know that even though it sounds like New Jersey's been backburnered for some time, but the proposals on the tax side were ludicrous.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately you're going to perpetuate the black market. Not only as you perpetuate the black market, that usually then that will continue to cast a negative pall upon the legal market, because there's just all the things that go on in the black market and the things that involve gangs and cartels and frankly unsafe products and unsafe practices are things that, that's why we shouldn't even have cannabis as part of our world.
Yeah.
When in fact, that's not really what's going on. And there's an illicit market in almost any product that's out there sold in any store. So this is the other thing we have to remember, is that
you're never going to fully stamp out.
You're not going to stamp it out.
But if you can get 80 or 90% of the transactions in the legal market, that's a huge win.
It's a huge win. Look, the bottom line is I can bake chocolate chip cookies in my kitchen, and I can go out there and have a bag of chocolate chip cookies that my daughter sells on the street. And that's cute and everything, except for at some point that's illegal.
Yeah.
And so I think we have this case where the grow your own dynamic in cannabis too is something we have to deal with, because I think this is creating also additional complexity to this same issue, because the entrepreneur on a very localized level and on a very small level at some point is going to realize he's got a business there, and he's either going to go legit and take it to the next level, or he's not. And I think the tendencies in cannabis right now are going to still be that this is going to complicate the water. I don't know how you feel about this. But.
Well, I think it's an interesting point that you bring up. Right now people are growing in a home. They're, probably growing more than the legal limit, and then there's an illicit market where they can trade that. One of the big issues that I think, one of the big opportunities to help curtail this is the establishment of brands and the establishment of quality, which you hit on earlier. Because, it's the same in the alcohol industry, right? There's not really an illegal trade, because nobody wants to take the risk that they're going to get a bottle of vodka that's going to make them go blind.
Right.
When they know that if they go to the store and they buy brand X, it's going to taste like this and it's going to have this effect, right? Yep. We don't have that yet with cannabis, but one day we will, where the consumer is like, yeah, I know I can get it cheaper in the black market, but I want to buy XYZ brand because I like the brand, I like the product, I like the way it tastes, I like the way the effect is, it's consistent, and it's tested, and I'm buying it through a legal channel, so it's safer.
Right.
Once we get check all those boxes, you'll see the consumer start to drive more sales in the legal market, and you won't have to use enforcement to shut it down.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at something that's also fascinating about the consumer side of this, is that where you're going to see people gravitate more towards, say, a product or a use case or a cannabinoid, something that is going to produce a particular outcome for them versus a brand, is where you first need to get kind of mass adoption. So at some point, we walked into stores. You're a young guy, I'm an old guy, but I remember my dad, once in a while, we'd go into the supermarket and he'd buy, instead of buying a 6-pack of Schaefer beer, he'd buy beer. He'd buy the No Frills beer, right? But he knows what beer is to him.
Yeah.
And obviously, we know how sophisticated beer taste has become in craft beers and this and that. I think what you're going to see in terms of the evolution of the brands and back to this total addressable market is we need cannabis and the byproducts of cannabis and the use cases of cannabis and CBD and all of the call it the OTC and the wellness products to be more commoditized and let people know this is what I want, this is the desired effect.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, this is the brand that I'm going to go to. And right now, as you say, I think it's been the opposite. And this is why people say we don't really know which the brands are that are going to win yet. And I believe that. And I also believe that at some point, Procter & Gamble wants to have a winning brand here. They're going to.
Yeah.
And that's why we're all paying attention to these guys.
Right. No, that's great. So, look, wrapping up, this has been a great dialogue.
Yeah.
I think, it'd be probably prudent for us to kind of talk about what we see, what are the most exciting things happening right now that you're seeing, and in the future, right? What's the near-term stuff that's going to be that we should be on the lookout for? Yep. Obviously, we talked about regulation and legislation at the federal level, but what else?
Well, first of all, I'll stay in my lane as a markets guy first, and just talk about what is truly becoming the sophistication of the industry. So the sophistication in terms of, look, we have dedicated analysts at big, mature institutional investors, and you see this every day when you go to a conference. It's with no disrespect to the guy you met 2 years ago, who was a smart, actually frontier type of an investor. But you're now meeting with a manufacturing analyst. You're meeting with a consumer products analyst. You're actually, I'm sitting at tables next to Silicon Valley tech analysts and guys that really understand direct-to-consumer and software. So that's, to me, fantastic. And it's exciting because it also augurs the type of capital that's coming to the industry. It's scary, and it's scary both for companies and for investors to see, to feel like you've been big fish in a small industry and see big players coming in, and that exists anywhere. But I think despite we talked about the frustrations of the capital markets, I think the good news is that companies are being held to a higher standard. Corporate governance and transparency are the rule, not the exception. Companies that have really operated with best practices will be rewarded. Those that have taken some extra care in both their business and in terms of their underlying protocols, I think will stand out. Management teams that accrete value in any industry, their company trades at a premium. So in cannabis, that didn't really matter. It hasn't really mattered to this point. It's been, a management team that went out and bought an asset and seemed to be ahead of everybody or raised some assets. But truly getting at management teams that think about the full spectrum of issues that management needs to think about. And they're not just operations, and they also are corporate governance, and they might even be cybersecurity. They might even be, so I think these all are exciting things. As it relates to the industry and the addressable market, again, I'm just most excited by the fact that the perception change in the country, I believe, has been pretty thoughtful. And I believe that people who 5 years ago never had any expectation that they would be consumers in this industry are reassessing, and with some education, both that comes from better understanding of some of the products that they've been consuming, which are frankly unsafe. So the reasons why people might be consuming cannabis in multiple forms is it's as a replacement for opioids and things that have been proven to be deadly and incredibly costly to our society. I'm excited by this. This is the stuff that, to me, is much more quantifiable in terms of an outcome and also just a public good. I think there's a benefit societally from, again, increased perception about where cannabis in the past, some of the social issues, the criminal justice issues that have been, I consider myself, I live in New York City, I've kind of grown up in a pretty integrated environment. I like to think that I'm a pretty thoughtful, compassionate soul, but maybe I'm not. I think I am. But I never thought about the criminal justice issues. I'm a white guy who grew up in an upper middle class community, and if I was a user and I got busted, I would have been slapped on the wrist and sent back to school or sent back to my job. I don't think people understand.
It wouldn't have ruined your whole life.
And I think there's a recognition that not only does there need to be expungement and there needs to be a reassessment of past crimes, but that going forward, there's going to be a much more thoughtful approach to how we address this. So those are my big picture stuff.
I love it.
And I think it would be helpful to hear from you as an operator. kind of the state of the industry and what gets you excited for the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, I mean, I think you hit on a great point, right? The social justice component to this industry, it's fascinating, and it's something that we as a business, the leading business in the industry, should be doing more to fuel. And we've got some initiatives that we're working on that are great, that are bringing a diverse workforce in, giving opportunity to people that haven't had it because of convictions and things like that. And so we want to be a leader. We want to embrace that, and I think it should be a core part of our industry. We see a lot of companies rallying around it, so that's phenomenal. Look, we're on the ground, right? We're seeing what's happening in these markets. It's interesting, right? So there's obviously this desire to build a national brand, and so I think what you're going to start to see is finally some of these brands getting to the majority of the markets, which hasn't happened. It's usually been, hey, we're a California brand, or we're in California, Nevada, or in Oregon, but now you've got these multi-state operators. I mean, the deal that Curaleaf just did to buy Select. I mean, you're talking about
East
somebody
Coast, West Coast,
very strong on the East Coast.
Yep.
Now getting one of the strongest assets on the West Coast, and for the first time, you're going to see these brands get everywhere. And the question is, now can you establish that consumer loyalty and trust? Right, because I think it's important that consumers have access, and it's been failed brand launches when there's all this hype, but it's only available in Colorado. Right? It's hard to get the universal customer base engaged there. So now that they're getting that access and the distribution, can they start to solidify these brands? So we're going to be on the lookout for that. I think it's an interesting dynamic. Another dynamic, we've seen, and we were kind of at the. We were one of the first to go public at a young age, right? We officially filed with the SEC in 2015.
Yeah.
The company's doing less than 10 million in sales, going public. It doesn't make any sense, but this industry forced us. And a lot of the other companies have done the same thing, because it's the only way to get capital. And now we have over 250 public cannabis companies, right? Some of them still very small, some of them quickly maturing into real businesses, which is great to see. But I'm looking for the private markets, right? We know that Silicon Valley, and I'm from the Bay Area, so I watched this, I went to high school in San Jose. I watched, Silicon Valley's been phenomenal, and it's been fueled by private venture markets. And
sorry about your Sharks, by the way.
Oh, it's all right. We've got the Warriors, so we're okay.
Yes, you do.
So, I'm anxious to see, how these private markets are going to start to develop, and can companies now get meaningful capital in the private markets and avoid all of the hullabaloo of going public, especially on the CSE. So that's another interesting dynamic that's playing out. But it's going to be an exciting year for cannabis. I know you and I both have high hopes.
We sure do.
For some of the big unlocks that we plan to see this year. So I look forward to getting back together, having more discussions. Appreciate your time today.
This is great. I mean, I think this kind of dialogue is very helpful, and it's nice to really get at kind of the core of the business and talk about the bright spots, the challenging spots, because we're going to have a lot of that over the next couple of years. So
sounds good, my man.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Good to see you.